Welcome to The Explainer. All right, think about any big organization. You've got dozens, maybe hundreds of small, manageable risks floating around. But what happens when those risks start to connect? When they start talking to each other behind the scenes? Well, that's when a bunch of small problems can suddenly snowball into one giant, catastrophic failure. Today, we're diving deep into the concentration of risk and how to actually see the whole, dangerous picture. So, how does this happen? How do all these little, seemingly harmless risks gang up to create a disaster? The answer, more often than not, comes down to a really simple but incredibly dangerous organizational habit: siloed thinking. Okay, here's a great way to think about it. Imagine a patient being treated by a whole team of top-notch medical specialists, but none of them are talking to each other. The cardiologist prescribes a drug for the heart. The nephrologist prescribes one for the kidneys. Now, in isolation, each prescription is perfectly safe, maybe even life-saving. But combined, the interaction could be absolutely lethal. That right there is the danger of managing risks in silos. So what's the big deal? The bottom line is, with this siloed approach, nobody, and I mean nobody, is looking at the total risk the organization is exposed to. A dozen small, totally acceptable risks can add up behind the scenes to become one massive, unacceptable, company-ending risk. To fight this kind of blindness, we have to move away from these isolated guesses and adopt a systematic process. So step one in getting a handle on this mess is just identification. You have to recognize all the threats to an organization's income, to its assets. And honestly, this is often the hardest step. Why? Because you can't manage a risk you haven't even identified or put a name to. And you've got to understand, this isn't some one-and-done checklist you just tick off. It's a continuous loop. Risk management never, ever stops because the world and the risks in it never stop changing. So once you've spotted a risk, the next logical step is to figure out what kind of risk it is, to classify it. Now, for you guys, this table isn't just about memorizing definitions, right? The real magic here is about accountability. Categorizing risks like this is absolutely critical because it determines who owns the problem. Let's say there's a sudden supply chain failure. Is that an operational risk that the logistics team has to handle, or is it an external risk from some big geopolitical event that the C-suite needs to get involved in? That distinction changes absolutely everything about how you respond. And that's exactly what a question like this from a past paper is getting at. Can you look at a real-world company, in this case a family-owned manufacturer, and identify that full spectrum of risks it's facing? The complete answer requires you to apply these categories across everything they do, from the credit risk they have with their customers all the way to the operational risks happening on the factory floor. Okay, so once we've got our risks sorted into buckets, the next big split we need to make is between the risks you just can't shake and the ones you absolutely can and should manage away. Okay, now here's the part that really matters, the bit that goes beyond the textbook definition. The market actually pays you to take on systematic risk. That's the price of admission, that's what gets you potential returns. But, and this is a big but, it gives you absolutely zero credit, zero reward for taking on diversifiable risk. Why? Because the market just assumes you're smart enough to get rid of that yourself. And this quote, it just nails it. It gives us a fantastic, practical rule of thumb. It shows just how powerful diversification can be. With enough different assets, you can pretty much eliminate those unrewarded, company-specific risks, leaving you exposed only to the big, broad movements of the market itself. So if diversification is the answer for an investment portfolio, what's the equivalent for an entire company? How do we apply that same logic to a whole business? Well, that brings us to the modern solution for breaking down those dangerous silos we talked about. And that's where ERM comes in. Think of it as that primary care doctor we imagined earlier. ERM is the framework that gets all the specialists into the same room, forces them to look at all the prescriptions together, and assesses the health of the entire patient, the entire organization. And that is the whole point. The entire goal of ERM is to sniff out where different risks are starting to pile up on each other and interact. It's designed to find those hidden concentrations, like having way too much exposure to a single supplier, a single major customer, and a single foreign currency all at the same time. That's a triple threat that would be completely invisible if you were just looking at each department on its own. This whole idea is beautifully captured in what we call the actuarial control cycle. It's not just a one-time checkup. It formalizes this idea that risk management has to be a constant, iterative process. You define the problem, you build a solution, and then, crucially, you monitor the results to see if your solution is actually working in the real world. A past exam question actually hit on this exact thing, asking how you'd use this cycle for designing a new pension scheme. A great answer would show how you'd use it to specify the problem, like how do we fund retirements when people are living longer than ever? Then you'd develop a solution, and then you'd be continuously monitoring things like investment returns and demographic shifts. But here's where it gets really interesting. A truly enterprise-wide view of risk, it's not just about playing defense and avoiding disaster. If you do it right, it can become one of the most powerful competitive advantages a company can possibly have.
I mean, this just flips the entire script on its head, doesn't it? The goal isn't to eliminate all risk. Gosh, if you did that, you'd eliminate all your returns too. The real goal is to understand your risks so intimately, so deeply, that you can confidently take on the right risks, the ones your competitors are too scared to even touch, because you know exactly what you're doing and what you can handle.
And how do you do that? Well, it's all guided by a really clear, quantified risk appetite. This isn't about vague feelings or gut instincts. It's about hard numbers. It's a policy that says something like, we will never take on a risk that has more than a 5% chance of causing our capital to fall below 150% of the regulatory minimum. See? That's a real rule you can build a whole strategy around. All right, we have covered a ton of ground here, moving all the way from the problem of silos to the massive strategic advantage of a solid framework. Let's pull all the key terms together and make sure we see how they form one complete picture. So this 6-step process, you gotta have this down. It's the engine that drives any solid risk program. It's what turns all those abstract, scary threats into a manageable, continuous workflow that can actually adapt to a constantly changing world. And these 4 concepts right here, this is your toolkit. is the overall strategy. Concentration of risk is the hidden monster you're hunting. Systematic risk is the price you pay to be in the game. And risk appetite? That's your compass, guiding every single decision you make. And this final exam question we're looking at, it really pulls everything we've talked about together. You see, a top-tier answer wouldn't just talk about stocks and bonds. It would discuss the nature of the scheme's liabilities, the critical importance of diversification, and most importantly, how that investment strategy must align with the sponsor's specific, quantified appetite for risk. Which, of course, leaves us with one last big question. If enterprise risk management is such a great answer, why do we still see these huge, seemingly sophisticated institutions fail so spectacularly? Well, understanding the framework is one thing, but having the culture, the courage, and the discipline to actually execute it under pressure, especially when all the incentives are pulling you in different directions, well, that's another thing entirely. And that highlights the constant, dynamic challenge of managing risk.